Hello and welcome to Falmouth University virtually. My name's Tom Upton. I am the course leader for architecture at Falmouth University. I'm an architect myself and teach on the undergraduate Part 1 programme and the Master's programme. And today I'm going to talk to you about the climate challenge and the emergency that's really facing the industry, and how thinking about how we might change and what we need to change as architects and as students of architecture in the future to meet that challenge, and what the next steps of that might be. So yes, welcome to Falmouth. That's me, Tom Ebden, as I've just explained, and we're going to be talking today about the climate emergency. Just to kind of kick off, here's a project that we were involved in with our first year architecture students last year, which explains some of the environment in which we enjoy working in. This is a site at Cape, Cornwall, the far western tip of the United Kingdom, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, and that kind of black a building you can see on the hillside is something that our architecture students designed and built. I'll talk a little bit more about that later and the kind of reasons why that's important in a moment. What we're going to look at very briefly today is, what is the climate emergency? What is the challenge? How is the construction industry responsible for that, for some of the problems that we see at the moment as well? Importantly, what can we do to change, and how do we kind of face up to those challenges here at Falmouth University in the way in which we think and teach and talk about architecture? So let's look at the problems first. Sorry if this is going to be a bit doom and gloom to start with, but we'll end on a more positive note. So the problems are big, massive problems for the world. We've got rising carbon dioxide levels, finite resources, global temperature rises, melting polar ice caps, lots and lots of more extreme weather events happening annually. So, flooding, extreme heat, extreme cold. I mean, look at the recent events in Texas in the United States a month ago, where they had such a severe cold snap. When we talk about the age of the Anthropocene, it might not be a word you're familiar with, but that is the new definition of the epoch of the globe, in which we're really starting to see the human impact in the geological condition of the planet. So that for the first time in the history of the planet Earth, the markers of human activity are there. And that's a worrying shift from basically a kind of benign existence that we had with the globe to having a damaging impact on the planet. And we need to really think about how we're going to change that relationship. So the construction industry, what is the problem here? What are the causes for concern? And unfortunately, there's a lot, and there's a lot that we need to change in order to fundamentally move away from a kind of resource heavy into a much more sustainable future for the planet. So the biggest culprits, we're just going to focus on three today. Concrete, the kind of wonder product, I suppose, which has been used for so long, but also is one of the most serious polluters on the planet. So for every 1,000 kilograms of concrete produced, 900 kilograms, so normally nearly exactly the same amount of CO2 is emitted, which is a frightening statistic. And cement, so the one of the core ingredients of concrete, is responsible for 8% of the CO2 emissions globally every year. So just concrete on its own is responsible for 8% of all CO2 emissions for the globe. That's a really worrying statistic. It's an enormous number. And if you compare that to plastic waste, you think about the amount of plastic produced over the last 60 years is about 80 billion tonnes of plastic. The cement industry produces nearly that amount every 2 years. So it's a fundamentally huge industry which has a lot of implications for the way in which we think. And obviously the construction industry uses a lot of concrete and needs to think about that future. One of the other things that is a big concern is the petrochemical industry. So all of the things extracted out of the ground through oil, which can be converted into materials. So a lot of those in the building and design industry are to do with insulation materials. So the materials you wrap a building up to keep it either warm or keep it cool. And it's good to wrap buildings up, and lots of modern buildings are very highly insulated now, which is a good thing because it reduces the energy they need to keep themselves warm and cooled. But a lot of those insulation materials are derived from petrochemicals. So that is a non-renewable energy source dug out of the ground. So oil extracted out of the seabeds and other places around the globe. And alongside that, also many of the products produced this way are toxic and are considered as pollution risks, both hazardous to air and to water supplies. And that's designated by EU directives. And there is a known risk and danger of using those products and how they are used after their current life comes to an end. The destruction and disposal of those materials causes pollution to air and water. And the kind of third piece of this jigsaw puzzle is non-renewable energy sources that are used in buildings for heating and cooling. So many buildings are heated and cooled by the burning of fossil fuels, such as gas and oil. And that still goes on a lot, is still going on in current designs. I mean, it's good to note that this is changing, and that, for example, in the UK, we are at historic lows of coal-fired power stations, and we are producing more and more wind and solar energy every year on year. But there is still a lot to do to change that kind of issue. And all three of those are combining to a kind of huge impact that the construction industry has. So how do we change? And that's the big question here. And as students thinking about coming and studying architecture is something that you need to be thinking about now. And it's going to inform your decisions over the next stages of your career. But we need to change that status quo. One way of doing that is to research and develop alternatives. So looking at alternatives to concrete. I mean, we do that actively, and many of our projects now think and engage people like structural engineers as well as material specialists to think about how we're going to build without concrete. And we'll be doing projects in the next month or so that will be test beds of ideas about how we can use alternatives. One alternative to concrete foundations is using recycled car tyres filled with a sand aggregate dug into the ground to provide a really firm, stable base of which you could then build on top of, much the same way as you would do with a concrete foundation traditionally in the ground. But we do need to start from the ground up, so we need to shift the way in which we teach architecture, the way we think about it, and the way in which we design architecture. And you are the future. You are the future generation of architects, so it has to start with you. That's how this shift will happen coming through over the next few years. We will need to lobby governments. There's lots of kind of decision making that happens at government level, no matter what country you're in. You need to have a voice, and you need to be informed, and you need to care about the issues, because these are the fundamental issues about the future of the planet. So how have we changed the way in which we teach architecture in Falmouth? And it's something we've thought about a lot over the last few years, because it's such a huge issue, and it's the big issue of our time. So we've put in place three fundamental changes which challenge that, which is a ban. An absolute ban on concrete in all our student projects. So that doesn't matter if it's a real live build project like we do, like the one I showed you just at the beginning of this presentation, and I'll show you a bit more of, or a kind of paper-based design that students are working on. We do not allow you to use concrete anymore. You have to think about alternatives, of which there are many, and think about the implications of using those. We've also banned petrochemical insulation materials. Don't need to use those anymore. Lots of amazing alternatives out there, such as lamb's wool or sheep's wool or recycled newspaper, or loads of recycled materials now being used as ways of insulating buildings. So actually being kind of creative in thinking and then following that through a process of design allows you to explore and experiment with new materials. And then finally, an absolute ban on non-renewable energy sources for heating and cooling of buildings. So you can't say, if I ask the question to a design student, architecture student, how are you going to heat this building? And they say, I'm going to put a gas boiler in there. No way. What we're going to do is look at the alternative ways of using things like passive house design, using the sun and capturing that to store the energy, And actually, in many ways, going back to traditional design techniques, which were all about using the orientation of the building, so how the relationship between the sun, where it rises, where it sets, where it is in the day, and using that as ways of heating a building and also of minimizing the overheating of buildings in hotter climates. How does the way you learn and think about architecture help you to kind of talk about these issues and make decisions in the future about how we change this stuff? So the way in which we started to think about that at Falmouth is that it's really about the relationship that your design has to the planet. We talk about something called critical or even radical regionalism, the way of assessing your work in relationship to the local context, the place that you are designing it for, and the relationship that the architectural proposal that you'll be working on has to that place. The way in which we really get our heads around that, because it's quite a tricky concept, is through making, through building. So from actually designing and then through a hands-on live build project process, actually physically building small-scale buildings. Now that for us is the best way of kind of making you understand the relationship between place, materials, decisions, choices, and architecture. It helps you to understand materials, it helps you to make informed decisions. So just to give you some examples of the types of projects that we do which begin to address those issues. Over the years we've been building projects in different locations, different types of scales with the students. So the students are the designers and then the students are the makers and the builders for these projects. The top right image there is something we did at the Eden project in Cornwall to design a kind of fire pit shelter. The bottom left one there is a wind shelter that we built, again looking over the North Atlantic coast. And bottom right is a tower that we built for a festival that took place. So there's this idea about how through a hands-on process of designing, you really understand the implications of the decisions that you're making and critically the relationship of the piece of architecture to the landscape, to the place that you're designing it for. Most recently, we're working on a brick building project. That's going to happen in April, quite soon, where a hands-on brick-making workshop where you physically get to build, make bricks from the clay extracted from the very ground in which you're making them from, in a site in St Austell in Cornwall, incredible location. And there you can see, this is from last summer, a firing event, a kiln to fire those bricks. So the students will go through that process of understanding exactly what it takes to extract, to mix clay, to make them, turn them into bricks, to dry them, and then to fire them. And then we will be building with those bricks that are fired, and we'll be making some experimental brick structures out of them. So this complete kind of process, and it's not an unknown quantity. You're not specifying some material that's come from the other side of the world. You're actually physically just making the stuff and using it. So that there's no carbon footprint to this stuff. It's zero carbon. There's no travel distance. It's all being used really locally, and then it will be developed into design proposals for the local community. We also get our students, this is Charlie, who's a current third-year student, kind of exploring the conditions of the site. So here he is, he made a kite, which was a way of exploring his design proposal, and then he flew it on the site in which he was proposing to build this building. So he has a really great understanding of the conditions of that site. And then that kind of journey translates into buildings which really feel part of a landscape. So becoming an architectural student who understands the place that they're designing for, the materials that you're working with, and how to then really integrate those things into different proposals. This was a design by Adam, who's a third-year student, for how to integrate a kind of series of swimming pools that's nestled on the Cornish coast. Beautiful piece of design work, which used these materials which were found from the local area. I'm going to show you now a short film which is about this project called Gorthweth that we built with the architecture students last year, the first year students. So you guys could be doing this type of project in September, which was working with something called the National Trust in the UK and the Arts Council on a project to design and then physically build a pretty decent sized building, which was then to house the filming of a short film that was produced by an artist. That's an image of the frame of the building being built on the site, and there's a bit more, but it's much better explained in this short film. So I'll play that now, and then I'll just round up at the end of this. Thank you.
Hi Jack, it's Callum Mitchell here.
The film is called Gorsweth, which is Cornish for contrast, and that in itself was something I had in the back of my mind when approaching making the film, as I was keen to highlight the different personalities and voices and people essentially that make up the communities surrounding the Tin Coast. They include Jack Freestone, who's an ex-miner and gravedigger, Lillian Phelan, who runs the Chippy in Pendeen, John Coke, who's the landlord of the North Inn and has been in Pendeen, his family have since 1849. Ali Scott, who's a local gallery owner and environmentalist. Molly Wright, who's a care worker and environmental activist. Nina Royal, who's an artist who's based in St Just, and Farmer Morris, whose shed we're standing outside right now.
So what we've tried to do is have something that has a palette of materials that make sense within this incredible location. So that means that we've actually ended up making a structure made out of recycled agricultural shed, and then we've sort of reappropriated it and redesigned it so it fits into the context of the site.
Quite interesting for us because you get to see the design process from start to finish really, and within like the last week of the process, I suppose. So it's quite exciting.
We created it in the workshops, and we're just doing now the last little bits to keep it all together, screwing the noggins to make sure it's as strong as it can be.
Because of the remoteness of the site, we've had to split the building into lots of different components, and the students have been working in groups to build those components together. There's no way that you can forget that buildings exist in kind of special places and unique places and need to respond to the environment around them.
Realities of designing for a place, understanding the materials, how they might reflect a place, its social, its cultural history, and how that might be then used to reinterpret a story of the landscape. And that's very much what this building's about for us. It gives that opportunity for people to test out ideas at a one-to-one scale, which often within the constraints of a School of Architecture you don't get to do.
I'm really enjoying it. I've never been on a construction site in my life.
It's not every day you build something on the edge of a cliff, but yeah, it's been alright so far, touch wood.
Hope you enjoyed that. Just a short taste of the kind of projects that we get involved in and the relationship between the landscape that we have and how that's so important, I think, for architecture students and the way in which you design, you think about and you consider all of these really interesting issues. Thanks for listening today. If you want to know more about the kind of work that we do, there's a couple of Instagram accounts there which are updated all the time, which show you our most recent and latest projects. And yeah, we'd be really happy to carry on this conversation with you as well. So if you want to get in touch with us, please do through the email applicant services at Falmouth or give us a call. Thanks for listening today. It's been really nice to talk to you, and I hope to see some of you very soon. Best of luck. Thank you and goodbye.
Falmouth universitetas ir mes kartu su Nerijum toliau čia plepam apie viską, ką paplepa universiteto atstovai. Kaip suprantu, apie šitą univerą turi daugiau ką pasakyti.
Tai iš tikrųjų tikrai atsimenu prieš kokius gal 4 metus, kai teko pačiam keliauti į universitetą, tikrai tokia įdomi kelionė, buvo truputėlį ir Anglijos pavyko pamatyti. Ir jeigu pasižiūrėti žemėlapį vietą ir lokaciją, kur randasi universitetas, tai pamatysit Anglijos žemėlapį, vedat ranką pačiuose pietuose ir pats kraštinis, reiškia, Anglijos miestas. Tai tikrai universitetas išsiskiria turbūt tuo, kad labai stiprus yra menuose ir turbūt išskirtinį vizitinį kortelį ir turbūt daugelis tikrai Falmouthą mato kaip vieną geriausių menų universitetų. Ir turėjęs tikrai daug studentų, kurie išvažiavo studijuoti būtent į Falmouth universitetą ir prisimenu vienos iš savo studentės pasakojimą, Evos Marginaitė, kuri dabar jau yra absolventė, yra baigusi universitetą, kad jinai 2 metus iš eilės stojo į šitą universitetą į aktorinį. Ir tikrai labai konkurencinga programa. Ir atsimenu, 1 metais buvau priimta studijuoti Eva ir neišvyko studijuoti. Dėl to, kad turėjo draugą, reiškia, liku čia, tada 2 metais vėl atėjo tvarkytis dokumentus, susitvarkė, vėl įstojo į aktorinį. Ir tikrai motyvavau Eva, kad važiuotų studijuoti. Ir tikrai buvo labai dėkinga ir tą teisingą sprendimą priėmus. Ir atsimenu, kai mes kalbam apie pačią studijų programą, kiek jinai yra konkurencinga, tėva po to, kada buvau grįžus Kalėdų atostogų, pasakojo taip, kad, sako, reiškia, atvažiavus į universitetą, turėjom paskaitą, kurią vedė direktorius. Ir jisai pasakojo tai, kad į mūsų studijų programą priima 60 žmonių per metus. Tai pasakė, kad vietų, kiek jie norėjo žmonių patekti, tai buvo apie 4000 žmonių pretendavo į 60 vietų. Tai vat galit susidaryti įspūdį, kokia yra konkurencinga pati studijų programa. Ir kaip minėjau, pats universitetas tikrai yra nuostabus menuose. Tikrai...
Čia apie architektūrą dabar buvo daug kalbos, ne? Kiek stiprus šitas universitetas architektūros studijose?
Jeigu įdėmiai klausėt pačios paskaitos dėstytojų, kuris vedė architektūrą, tai jis tikrai mane taip pat nustebino, aš galvoju, gal labiau gilinsis į pačią studijų programą, bet architektūrą jisai palėtė visiškai skirtingais kampais apie medžiagas, kurią naudoja, apie betoną, kurį naudoja ir kiek CO2 išskiria pats, reiškia, naudojimas statybose ir palyginu, kad tiek, kiek plastikų sunaudojama turbūt per 60 metų ir kai tai kenkia mūsų aplinkai, tai statybų sektorėje vien tik tai cementas per 2 metus padaro tokią žalą. Ir tikrai labai įdomiai kalbėjo apie tai, kaip yra ieškoma alternatyvių medžiagų, kurios mažintų, reiškia, visą tą taršą, kas tikrai labai stipriai nustebino, nes atrodo architektas, tai reiškia, tai yra brėžiniai, projektai, kuriuos tu, reiškia, darai, bet ypatingai turbūt ta linkme viskas keliauja link ekologijos. Tai va šita dalis labai patiko, kas liečia pačią architektūrą, kas man tikrai pakankamai nauja pačiam buvo.